Thank you, Madam President. I want to say thank you to my colleagues from Alabama and Kansas for being out here on the floor today. I regret that we're here with this conflict and this confrontation, but I think that it reflects the deep divisions that exist in this country when it comes to abortion. That's something that I've always said that I understand deeply, that I respect people's different points of view when it comes to abortion in the United States. I do. It has led me to conclude, and I know that not everybody agrees with this, although the majority of Americans certainly agree with this, the majority of Coloradans agree with this, led me to conclude that this is a decision that should be made between a woman and her doctor. That's who should make the decision, that it shouldn't be made by the government. But at the same time, I realize there are differences of opinion. I hope that people on the other side realize that there are differences of opinion here too. But unlike the position that my colleague from Alabama espouses on the Senate floor, he's not with the majority of Americans on this issue, and that might be a point of pride for him. But I want to first call attention to the reason we're here tonight, which is that I just asked for unanimous consent to move forward the promotions of the flag officers for the Department of Defense. This is the fourth time that I've been on this floor asking us to do what Senates have done for 230 years. Never in the history of the United States of America, literally, never in the history of the United States of America has there been a senator who put a blanket hold on every single flag officer at the Department of Defense. Talk about playing politics. And by the way, I'll correct the record for a third time, if not the fourth time. My hold had nothing to do with flag officers. Mine had to do with a political appointee, and you can look it up. I'll find that article and I'll put it in the record again. In contrast to my hold, what the senator from Alabama is doing, and now the senator from Kansas and the rest of the people that are supporting this, including members of the House of Representatives who were here tonight, is a blanket hold on 200 military flag officers. A blanket hold on 200 military flag officers. That has never happened in the history of the United States. These are really important command positions. They're really important. I'm not going to go through all of them, although, Madam President, I'd ask that the list of all of these positions be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. The leader of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain is on this list. The leader of the Seventh Fleet in the Pacific is on this list. These are positions that are critical to checking Iran and to checking China as well. I was just in Bahrain. We visited with people with the Fifth Fleet, including people from Colorado that are stationed there. We know how important the mission is. I assume they know how important the mission is. I've heard them say out here, Senator from Louisiana before, that it's not generals that are important, it's the enlisted people that are important. Both are important. Both are important. You can't tell me that it's a good idea to have the Fifth Fleet not have the commander that they're supposed to have. Not to mention the fact that people that have spent their entire lives learning what's needed to get promoted into a position of that kind of trust and that kind of duty and patriotic responsibility, that when it comes time for them to fulfill their mission, that some politician on the floor of the Senate says, no, I'm putting a blanket hold on you and 200 other people because of my politics. I'll come back to that in a second. Our military representative to NATO is on this list. The future director of intelligence at U.S. Cyber Command is on this list. So it's not surprising that while the senator from Alabama may have his own particular view about military readiness, that other observers of what's going on here, including veterans of the DOD, are saying it's the senator from Alabama that's affecting our readiness. Just last week, 7 former Pentagon chiefs from Republican and Democratic administrations, both Republicans and Democrats, they sent a letter saying that the senator from Louisiana's bloc is, quote, harming military readiness and risk damaging U.S. national security. That's not me, that's them. By the way, Madam President, I'd like to ask to have that letter included in the record as well.
Without objection.
Quote, leaving these and many other senior positions in doubt at a time of enormous geopolitical uncertainty sends the wrong message to our adversaries and could weaken our deterrence. Today, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin, wrote that the longer this hold persists, the greater the risk the U.S. military runs in every theater, in every domain, and every service. He said this uncertainty, quote, diminishes our global standing as the strongest military in the world. I don't think it's surprising that he would say that, or political that he would say that. It's stating the obvious. When you can't do something that we've done for 230 years because of politics that's infected the floor of the Senate. Madam President, I'd like to enter Secretary Austin's letter into the record as well. So
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. So that any American who wants to read this stuff can actually read all of it and see all of it. The senator from Alabama, he said it again tonight, has said that he'll continue to hold these promotions for, quote, as long as it takes. As long as it takes. To which I think the obvious question is, as long as it takes to what? What is the political principle that he is on the floor using the unprecedented tactic of holding up every single flag promotion in the DOD and our U.S. military? What is it that he's trying to do? What principle is he trying to enshrine? The rule that he's objecting to, the rule that my colleague from Kansas is also objecting to, is a rule, Madam President, that does 3 things. One thing it does is say that if you are in need of reproductive health care and you're a woman who's in our military, that you can take paid leave to be able to do that. You don't have to take unpaid leave to travel to a place if you are stationed in, for example, a place like Alabama where abortion is illegal. I think only with the exception for the life of the mother, no exception for rape or incest. If you're serving in a state like Alabama where a doctor could go to prison for 99 years for performing abortion, where they're having debates down there about whether or not they can use laws that are written for fentanyl to apply to the use of chemicals during an abortion. But a state where, by the way, a majority of Alabamians say there should be some access to abortion. But if you are somebody who's stationed there through no fault of your own, you don't get to decide where you're going to be. If you sign up and you get sent to, for example, Alabama, what the Secretary of Defense said was, okay, we're going to pass a rule that says that if you have to take leave, you can take paid leave. We're going to say that if you you need to take a minute to think about whether you want to talk to your superior officer about the condition that you're in and the procedure that you have to take. Then what we're saying is you can take a little bit longer to do that, to tell your commanding officer. And we're saying also that we can pay for your travel, just like we do for other care, to leave your duty station and go someplace else. Those are the three things. So when he says, as long as it takes, I gather what he means when he says withdraw the memo, as long as it takes to make sure that a woman cannot travel from their duty station to someplace else and have that paid for like other procedures. That a woman has to take unpaid leave. They can't get paid leave, even though they can for other procedures, and that a woman has to tell her commanding officer the minute that she learns of this. But those are the three things. Those are the three things. That's why he's objecting to every single flag officer promotion. I don't know what to do about that, Madam President, because I'll bet you, can't prove it, but standing here tonight, I'd bet you that 80% of the American people would agree, no matter what their position was on the underlying issue here, would agree with those three policies. And by the way, I didn't compare abortion to bunions or abortion to LASIK. What I said was those other procedures are things that the same rules apply. That's what I said. And the reason that's important to this debate and the discussion that we're having right now is that my colleague from Alabama is saying that if it doesn't say reproductive services or reproductive health care or abortion in the statute books, that means that there's no ability for the Secretary of Defense to write rules to protect the rights of our enlisted, in this case, enlisted women. That's what he's saying. And what I've pointed out is that there is no place in statute that says that you can go get your footwork done or LASIK surgery. That's not in the statute, because this body and the House of Representatives confers judgment for this on the leaders of the the leaders of the Defense Department. And unlike the senator from Alabama, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the minefield that they're having to navigate. By the way, one other thing I just want to point out for the record, so that it's absolutely clear, is that nothing in this rule says that the U.S. government is paying for an abortion. There's nothing in this. There's nothing in these three things. So anybody on that side who says that's what this is about, that's a debate for another day. That's not the debate for this. But why do I say I have sympathy? Why do I have sympathy? I have sympathy because something has happened in America that I could never have imagined 30 years ago. I don't remember now what it was 30 years ago, 1997. Can't do the math. I hope the pages can do the math. 1993, I don't even have the date right. When I was in law school, something has happened that I never would have imagined. And that is the Supreme Court of the United States, for the first time in our history, for the first time since Reconstruction, has ripped away from the American people a fundamental right, a fundamental freedom. When I was the Page's age here, I never would have imagined that would have happened. When I was in law school, I never imagined that that would have happened. And that's because from our founding until today, in general, this country's history has always been about expanding freedoms and expanding rights and making our country more democratic, more fair, and more free. But after a 50-year campaign, none of this was accidental. After a 50-year campaign led by people, some people on the other side of the aisle here, they finally got what they wanted, which is Roe versus Wade being overturned. And then when it happened, you heard people, and we're having to deal with the consequences of that as a society, as a country. The Secretary of Defense is having to deal with that. When they say there's been a 40-year consensus, that consensus was ripped violently from the American people by the Supreme Court that stripped us of a 50-year consensus when it came to a woman's right to choose, when it came to that fundamental freedom. And then there were some people over on the other aisle, the other side of the aisle, said, don't be so hysterical. This is just returning it to the states. You don't need to worry about it. I don't think that was ever a genuine thing to say, but Madam President, I mean, just let's look at the facts here. 18 states have banned abortion since this happened. 9 of those states have no exceptions for rape or incest. In Texas, they are paying $10,000 bounties if your friend or your neighbor or the person down the street reports on you and reports that you are going to pursue something that has been a fundamental right in the United States of America for 50 years. It's a fundamental right in the state of Colorado, state that I represent. My colleague says that I'm pro-abortion. That's not why I'm out here. That's not why I'm out here. I'm sure he didn't mean to say that. I'm out here because I believe that when I can't, my judgment isn't better than the judgment of a woman and her doctor. And the government shouldn't be making the decision. And I am proud to live in a state that was one of the first states, probably, I think the first state in America, to enact a woman's right to choose, even before Roe versus Wade was passed. And it was the first state to codify Roe versus Wade after the Supreme Court overturned that precedent. Think about what's happening in Florida, Madam President. That's one of the biggest states in America. It's one of the largest states. I can't remember if it's the third largest state or the fourth largest state. It's huge. It is huge. They've just banned abortion in Florida at 6 weeks. Banned at 6 weeks. When I was the age of these pages, when I was in law school, that would have been unimaginable. There might be a reason why the governor down there signed that law at 11 o'clock at night. There might be a reason, because 65% of Floridians think it's a terrible idea. They think that this should be a decision that's made between a woman and their doctor. They don't need their governor telling them. They don't need a senator telling them. They don't need the federal government telling them or weighing in on this incredibly difficult decision. And we're here tonight because, as a result of that, I would say, balancing act, common sense approach that the Secretary of Defense have tried to take here when it comes to people that are serving in our military, that we now face real harm to our national security. Part of the challenge is the recruitment challenge that my colleagues talked about on the Republican side. And I can tell you the studies that have been done that have asked the question about what the reversal of Dobbs is going to mean for recruitment in the Department of Defense, the presiding officer won't be surprised to know it's not good. It's not going to make matters better if you think that you can be assigned to a state where they've outlawed abortion, or they're saying that doctors can get a 99-year prison sentence, or there are no exceptions for rape or incest or the life of the mother, or you're Florida and now you have a 6-week ban, that may affect the recruiting that goes on in the United States military. Not to mention the 700,000 civilians that serve in the Department of Defense. Service members don't decide where they're going to serve. DOD decides. And before Dobbs, our troops at least had some assurance. And today they don't have any assurance. That's why we're here. So any talk of this 40-year consensus ignores completely what has happened. And what has happened is the Supreme Court overturning Roe against Wade. And I just want to say for my colleagues tonight that I think it's important for the American people to understand, it's important for the next generation of Americans to understand that this did not happen by accident. For 50 years, there's been a campaign in America to strip us of this fundamental right, to strip us of this fundamental freedom. And when I was in law school in the early 90s, it was just after this new legal doctrine had been invented in America called originalism. You know, I've said here on the floor that I think whoever came up with that name should get the Pulitzer Prize for political names. It's genius. It's genius, because the idea is that somehow by putting on your originalist view of the world, you're going to be able to divine what the Founding Fathers were writing when they wrote the Constitution. That if you are a judge, you are restricted to what they refer to as the plain meaning of the Constitution. And that if you can't get to the plain meaning, that you should be able to divine their intention as close to the text as possible, as if it is possible to derive the original intent of the founders. And because if you are somebody who believes that you can do that, you are channeling George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin or John Adams, that you have a leg up on anybody else who's trying to interpret what the Constitution says. Because if you know what they were originally saying, if you have that secret decoder ring to tell you what they're originally saying, then that gives you an elevated position over anybody else who might disagree with you. In fact, there isn't really room for disagreement since you've divined what the founders believed. I have no idea where the pages are in their history lessons on the American Constitution. I hope they do. I'm sure they do. But anybody who has read anything about the Constitution of the United States knows that almost every word is a product of compromise. Almost every word is a product of compromise. There's some things in there where you can't, it's not confusing about what they said. And I owe my friend Angus King on this. I'd like to put an article into the record that he wrote, my colleague from Maine.
Without objection.
You know, there are supposed to be, not supposed to be, there are 2 senators from every state. That's in the Constitution. I don't think we're going to disagree about what that means. I know that the people on the floor staff tonight are thinking, I wish there were one senator from Colorado who would stop talking, and I will stop talking. But that's what it says. And I can read the plain meaning of that. 2 senators. But it becomes less clear when the words are things like, and again, credit to Angus King, due process. Or when the words don't even show up in the Constitution of the United States. Air Force, because they didn't have a single plane when they wrote the Constitution of the United States. Now, I think that Thomas Jefferson's view of this was certainly closer to mine than some others, which was that they expected the government to evolve. They expected the interpretation of these documents over time to evolve. And that's a good reminder, by the way, of the disagreements that the founders had originally. Their original intent. Some of them were slave holders. In the case of Thomas Jefferson, in the case of George Washington, in the case of Madison. Some of them were abolitionists in the case of John Adams. But that was a fundamental thing that, you know, ended up being wrestled to a horrendous compromise that allowed slavery to continue in the United States of America. And the results of that horrible compromise are going to be with us for the rest of our days. But if you had told me when I was in law school that a majority of the Supreme Court of the United States would subscribe to originalism, I wouldn't have believed it. I would not have believed it. Maybe one justice? There had never been a justice on the court who ever signed up to that thing called originalism because it hadn't been invented yet. When, you know, it had just been invented. But I read Justice Alito's majority opinion for the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case, and man, he believes it because the fundamental conviction is if it wasn't a freedom in 1868, if it wasn't a freedom in 1868, it's not a freedom today. It's not a right today. That's what the originalist view would be. The dissent points out that the men who ratified the 14th Amendment in 1868, quote, did not perceive women as equals and did not recognize women's rights. When the majority says we must read our foundational charter as viewed at the time of ratification, it consigns women to second-class citizenship. By definition. How can that not be true? Women were second-class citizens when the Constitution was written. They were second-class citizens when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. It took women in this country another 50 years, almost, after 100 years of fighting for it, to get the right to vote in America, the self-evident right to vote. And because the Supreme Court majority didn't have to wrestle with the realities of this freedom, the realities of this right. Because for them, the only pertinent question was it around in 1868? That's not completely fair to them. They were asking questions about, like, was it around 300 years ago, 400 years ago? But ignoring the 50 years that had been a right, that had been a freedom in the United States of America, they didn't have to contend, nor did they want to contend, with the effects their decision was going to have on everyday people in the United States of America, including people that serve in our military. One of the very first calls I got after Dobbs was decided was from a woman that I know who was an officer in the Air Force, who called me and said, "Michael, let me tell you a story about my life, decisions I had to make. And now, what are people going to do?" And we talked about the privacy issues that were at stake. Those aren't even touched on here. If I were in charge, I'd hope that we'd have something in there about privacy, but we don't have anything. There's not even anything about privacy. Everybody in the unit's going to know everything that there is to know. She wanted to know about that, but what she really wanted to talk about was readiness. This is going to affect our readiness. And in response to that concern, the Pentagon drew up these three policies: travel allowances for service members, as I mentioned, being able to take your absence without unpaid leave, and more time for service members to be able to tell their commanding officers. That's all it is. And now the senator from Alabama is out here saying that, you know, it's making the DOD into an abortion factory. Or, you know, not, he didn't say it tonight, but he said it before, into an abortion travel agency. And that's why he's holding up these 200 flag officers. And I'm really worried, Madam President. I'm really worried about what the implications of this are, because I don't know what is going to make him stop. And I don't know what damage is going to be done to our national defense in the meantime. And I'll say I am you know, I believe very strongly that this country should codify a woman's right to choose at the national level. I believe that. I believe that. Most Americans agree with that position. Most Americans disagree with the Supreme Court. Most Americans disagree with the 50-year campaign that's reversed Roe versus Wade. And we have to adjust to this new reality. It's not about evading laws or evading statutes. It's about supporting the men and women in our military, in our armed services. That's what this is about. That's what this is about. And to hold hostage the promotions of the flag officers at DOD because of your particular view of a woman's right to choose, or whether Dobbs was rightly decided by the originalist majority that now sits on the Supreme Court, that's pretty tough, man. That's pretty tough. I mean, it's tough enough that this right has been stripped and this freedom has been stripped. I think there are people who thought it wasn't really going to happen in America. I thought it wasn't going to happen. I didn't. When I was at the age of the pages here, when I was in law school and college, it's the last thing from my mind is that this would happen. I think it's surprising to the American people. And I think it would be very surprising to the American people if they knew that there were a member of the United States Senate using a procedure that has never been used in the history of our country to try to impose their view of of social policy. And I don't think the American people should accept this. And I don't think, I'll tell you, I know that Colorado doesn't accept this. In Colorado, as I said earlier, we protect reproductive care for service members. We do it, we protect it for everybody in my state. And we do everything we can to protect our readiness as well. We're home in Colorado to the U.S. Air Force Academy, to Fort Carson, to Schriever, to Peterson, to Buckley, and to Space Command. And in the case of Space Command, we have a live example, Madam President, of how the Supreme Court's decision could hurt our national security. This is one of the saddest stories that I know. I'm sorry to be here tonight telling this story, because I think that decisions about where to locate our military installations should be made in the national security interests of the United States of America. That's what I believe. And it's devastating to think that we could have had a situation where elected leaders, politicians, a president, could play politics instead of making a decision in our national security. But in the case of Space Command, that's exactly what happened. Every top general in the Air Force that was asked recommended Peterson in Colorado Springs as the home for Space Command. And there were three reasons. One was it could get stood up faster than if it were moved anywhere else. It was going to be cheaper to repurpose buildings that were there. And because they were also concerned that if they moved it from Colorado, there would be massive attrition, both in the DoD workforce and the civilian workforce. That was their conclusion. That was their conclusion. Leave it in Colorado. And President Trump overruled them. Every general said, leave it in Colorado. They went into the White House. The president made a different decision, said, move it to Alabama. Let's send Space Command to Alabama. How do I know he made the decision on politics, not on national security? How do we know that? Well, he went first on a radio program called, this is President Trump, went on a radio program called The Rick and Bubba Show, and they asked him, and he said, I single-handedly moved it to Alabama. They wanted it to be somewhere else, but I single-handedly moved it to Alabama. The GAO and DOD's own Inspector General confirmed these facts. Confirmed these facts about the generals saying it should be in Colorado and President Trump saying, I single-handedly made the decision. Mayor John Suthers, who's the mayor of Colorado Springs, he confirmed these facts. In fact, in a letter to Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, here's what Mayor Suthers wrote, Madam President. In the spring of 2019, President Trump told him that, quote, despite any process the Air Force was pursuing, he, President Trump, would make the decision personally, and the only question is whether it would be before or after the 2020 election. In February 2020, when Mayor Suthers, not that it matters, but just for the record, Mayor Suthers is a Republican mayor. This is not a Democratic mayor that's recalling these statements by President Trump. It is a Republican mayor. In February 2020, when Mayor Suthers again made his case to President Trump to keep Space Command in Colorado, Trump asked him if he was a Republican. He's a Republican. I don't know why that mattered, but he's a Republican. When Mayor Suthers replied that he was, President Trump asked what President Trump's chances were of carrying Colorado in the 2020 election. After Mayor Suthers responded that his chances were uncertain, quote, uncertain, he noticed that made the president seem, quote, perturbed. President Trump said again he would make the decision after the 2020 election, and he wanted, quote, to see how it turned out. To see how the election turned out. Generals all recommended Colorado. They went into the White House. President Trump overturned what they said, and in his own language, we know the reason why. I'd like to enter this letter into the record, Madam President.
Without objection.
And instead of removing this stain of politics from this decision, DOD, I'm sad to say, has proceeded as if nothing were wrong, as if there were just a garden variety bureaucratic process that they're going through. An inevitable outcome that preserves that political judgment, which would be a horrendous precedent for our country. Horrendous. It would ratify a political decision that should have been a decision made in the interests of our national security. It would be a green light for future presidents to do the kind of thing. There are estimates that the attrition could be as much as 80% if you move this from Colorado to Alabama. And the reason this comes up in the context of this debate is that in Colorado, we have preserved a woman's right to choose. In Alabama, they have banned it. No exceptions for rape or incest. And now the representatives, the senators from Alabama, don't want anybody to be able to pursue their interests and their judgments about their own health care. President Trump's decision would be a self-inflicted wound as we face a major land war in Ukraine and the saber rattling that we are hearing in the Pacific. Every day that goes by, there's another article about how critically important our space assets are in this fight for freedom all around the world. I'm really, really pleased that President Biden is coming to Colorado Springs next month to speak to the graduating class of the Air Force Academy. And I hope that's going to give us the opportunity to learn about, this decision and how harmful it was, and give us the chance to restore integrity to the process, ensure that national security, not politics, drives our basing decision. And at the same time, give us the chance, once again, to stand on the side of expanding rights and expanding opportunity in America, not restricting it. The Supreme Court had no interest in grappling with the consequences of their ruling on our country, on our society, on the men and women in uniform, on our national security. They didn't have to, because if it wasn't a right in 1868, it's not a right today. If it wasn't a freedom in 1868, it's not a freedom today. The men and women in our 21st century Department of Defense deserve better than that. Men and women who have signed up to serve this country selflessly deserve better than that. I heard my colleague from across the aisle say that this was a country about the stronger defending the weaker. I don't think that's what this is about. This is about the responsibility each one of us had. Each one of us has. Whether we're born strong or weak or rich or poor, in Colorado or in Alabama, to uphold our national security, to uphold our democracy, to make sure that we land on the side of our highest ideals. I think most people feel like there's been too much politics in America lately. I think people would see that they have fundamental disagreements with each other about a woman's right to choose or an endless number of things. But I also think people could understand what would happen if, instead of continuing to debate, continuing to have a conversation, that our attitude was, I'm just taking my ball and going home. Or in the case of the senator from Alabama, I'm going to hold up 200 flag officers who have been duly promoted in our Department of Defense. So I don't know how this is going to end, Madam President. This is not a great day in the history of the United States Senate. There's a reason why all of our colleagues going back the 230 years haven't put the kind of hold that we've seen put on today. It's staggering to me that at a moment when the majority of Americans are saying they think that the decision in Dobbs was wrongly decided, that they think that this decision should be made between a woman and her doctor, that we be out here on the floor of the Senate using tactics that nobody ever used before to impose one's personal view on the rest of the country. And I would ask that the senator from Alabama reconsider the position that he's taken. And I would ask the Biden administration to undo the terrible political decision that President Trump himself said he was making single-handedly over the objection of the generals in the Air Force. And now, in the wake of the decision in Dobbs and seeing what the intention is among some folks on the other side of the aisle, there's no excuse to picking up this military installation, moving it all the way across the country, the United States of America, just to ensure that women don't have free exercise of their freedom, and to ensure that it's would be delayed as a result of going there, and that we will be less safe as a result of its going there. I know the temptation is strong to not overturn the previous decision because people, I think, are worried about looking political. It would be political to keep this political decision in place. They need to listen to the words of the Republican mayor, John Suthers. Listen to Donald Trump's own words. Listen to what the generals said. But this is the fourth time I've been out here, Madam President, on this issue, and I'm going to keep coming back as long as it takes. Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate your patience and your indulgence this evening, and I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.